Let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
I'm Laura, my friends call me Bo, and I'm here with my very good friend, my hero, the Lyme disease vaccine whistleblower, Kathleen Dixon. And we're going to tell you the truth about Lyme disease, the truth that nobody else will tell you. We're going to explain why the testing doesn't work, why it was designed not to work, why you can't get diagnosed or treated, why the treatment fails most of the time. We're going to tell you why kids are left to suffer and die without any diagnosis or treatment. We're going to explain to you why people can't get disability because they can't get diagnosed, all because of this crime. This is the truth about Lyme disease. It's a crime. And here's the proof.
The very definition of, quote, Lyme disease, end quote, is based on a crime of falsifying the diagnostic standard, such as to exclude almost all cases of Lyme. And then when they had the vaccine trial, and then tested people to see if they got Lyme after the vaccine, if they got sick one way or another, they could throw that out and say, well, that's not Lyme, because Lyme is this very narrow case definition. This slide shows you the difference in Western blotting between, on the left, late chronic neurologic immunosuppression Lyme, where you see very faint bands in the middle, and those middle 7 lanes are patient Western blots. The 2 outside lanes on the left of the IgM and IgG columns there are controls, or people with arthritis, such as you can compare what is the antibody type and concentration in people with chronic neurologic multisystem kind of Lyme. That's on the left. On the right, you see that the bands are much darker. That is a reflection of much higher antibody concentration of all types in people that have an HLA-linked autoimmune or allergy or hypersensitivity response. And that's only reflected in perhaps 15% of the population. Only 15% of the population, when bitten by a tick, are likely to have the arthritis or acrodermatitis outcome. And those patients do not have any other symptoms besides arthritis. They have no fatigue, they have no cognitive problems, no neuritis, no headache, nothing. So this slide shows you the differences in Western blotting between, on the left, neurologic Lyme, which is an immunosuppression disease, and on the right is the case definition. Importantly, everybody, the 85% who don't have the HLA-linked genetic background, were excluded from the case definition at Dearborn. That was the entire point of changing the case definition, because these late neurologic chronic multisystem protein outcomes of Lyme were caused by the OspA vaccine alone. This graphic shows you how Alan Steer added the ELISA, which is the first step in the Dearborn so-called 2-tier case definition, in which he arbitrarily raised the cutoff, as you can see at the bottom there, To exclude neurologic Lyme cases in the first step, you can see we point to raising the cutoff to leave out all neuro cases. That antibody concentration there in the ELISAs represents 5 standard deviations above baseline noise. Typically for any kind of analytical method, it's 3 standard deviations. You can see if it had been 3 standard deviations, it probably would have included the meningitis or the neurologic cases. But this is the first of the 2 aspects of Alan Steer falsifying the case definition in Europe, adding the ELISA and excluding all neurologic Lyme cases. This is a snippet from the 1993 Dressler-Steer report that was left out of the Dearborn booklet that shows how Alan Steer, together with Frank Dressler, falsified the case definition, such as to leave outer surface proteins A and B out of the diagnostic standard panel. They used high passage strains, which drop plasmids, therefore likely to drop the outer surface A/B plasmid, and then he put back in outer surface protein A and B without the lipid ends. He just put in the protein end. Without the lipids, they're less immunogenic and less likely to produce antibodies. The result is that outer surface protein A and B are missing from the diagnostic standard. And this is the research fraud right here in black and white, showing how Alan Steer did that. This patent that you're looking at is a patent owned by CDC officers William Gold, Joe Peisman, and Barbara Johnson, co-owned with SmithKline Beecham, dated 1993, which is a patent for recombinant Borrelia burgdorferi vaccine and test kit candidates. Note that this is 1993, which is the same year that Johnson sent Alan Steer to Europe to falsify the case definition. Barbara Johnson also held the Dearborn Conference, and in this patent it states that there are 2 outcomes to Borrelia antigens: MHC or HLA restricted and HLA non-restricted outcomes. So in 1993, here is Barbara Johnson, who ran the Dearborn stunt, owning 5 patents with SmithKline in Europe. At the same time, she's having Alan Steer falsify the testing to throw out all but the hypersensitivity cases. So it looks very damning, and people should know the purpose of the Dearborn stunt, to falsify the case definition, to leave out all but the arthritis cases, precisely served these CDC officers who probably illegally own patents with SmithKline in Europe. Lyme disease is a crime because it's a semantics kind of fraud. There was no other way to commercialize it except to lie about the testing, because the spirochetal diseases are spirochetes. They're their own phylum, and they're not regular bacteria, and they don't have LPS or lipopolysaccharide. They shed fungal antigens instead, not related to anything else, so that's why they're their own phylum. So people don't understand that. You can't really call it a bacteria. It's not a bacteria. You have to step farther back and look at what they are and what they do pathologically. They're parasitic spirochetes. They're not bacteria. This is a graphic from 2006 by Lynn Margulis showing the coevolution of ancient bacteria, thermophiles with spirochetes. This goes back to 500 million to 2.5 billion years ago. And because spirochetes are unique, their own phylum, ancient creatures, the equivalent of a microbial dinosaur or ginkgo tree, that's the reason that the ALDF.com and the CDC staff have gotten away with spinning this disease. The result here is that there is what we call a semantics game going on between what is the real definition of, quote, Lyme disease, end quote, and the chronic neurologic disease that they decided to throw out because it was caused by the OspA vaccine too. In 1998, Alan Steer published in a book called Lyme Disease, ACP Key Diseases Series by Ron and Evans, on page 114, that seronegative Lyme disease was a contradiction in terms if you're talking about the chronic arthritis, because
The antibody response seems to be involved in the pathogenesis of the disease. He then goes on to say, seronegative Lyme is a subtle attenuated illness. You know it's not a subtle attenuated illness. It's a very severe illness. What he means is that the antibody response is attenuated, or that this is a case of immunosuppression. In 2005, Klempner and Wormser reported that there were two different diseases. One was HLA-linked arthritis, and those people, they claim, don't have any symptoms besides arthritis. That's the case definition. But at least here they admit that there are two distinct syndromes. As most of you know, that's the problem. At the Dearborn Conference, these people threw out the chronic neurologic seronegative Lyme disease and kept only the 15% arthritis cases. So here these people are again, 11 years later saying, oh, there's two diseases. There's the arthritis, which is the case definition, and then there are these seronegative patients who have all the symptoms, the typical symptom complex that most people refer to as chronic Lyme. This is a transcript from a PBS special from the Life on Earth series about Lyme disease, featuring Lenny Siegel and Eugene Shapiro. They're part of the ALDFcom/CDC criminal cabal that falsified the case definition. And here we see Shapiro stating somehow for that form of the disease, antibiotics are effective. They do fine. But then there's some other form of the disease which you can't put your hand around it. They don't have objective findings of inflammation, let me insert there, that are HLA-linked hypersensitivity or arthritis, which is the way bacteria cause disease. Now, of course, these are not regular bacteria, and they're denying the fact that some bacteria are fungal shedders, and in particular spirochetes are ancient fungal shedders, and they cause immunosuppression. So this is an example of them trying to keep the lid on the disease, but they're going on public TV and saying, you know, there's only one kind of Lyme disease. There's the bad knee, and that's it.
On this slide, we have Raymond Datweiler at the 2001 FDA Lyme-Rix meeting. Note that this is 7 years after Dearborn, so the crooks have been saying now for 7 years that Lyme is just an arthritic knee. And Datweiler comes along and he says, I see a lot of patients, and I must say that treatment-resistant Lyme arthritis in our center is low. It's very rare. We see maybe one case a year. And you know, that's using very strict criteria, saying that the person had, you know, CDC criteria, i.e. Dearborn, for seropositivity, good history, and usually is monoarticulate knee arthritis. Hey, look at there. There's Datweiler saying 7 years after Dearborn that everybody's saying Lyme is just an arthritic knee, but he never sees any of those arthritic knee people. He's saying, you guys are nuts. Those people don't exist.
Brian Fallon here was able to find only 37 out of 3,400 patients who had chronic neurologic Lyme with all of the symptoms and who had a CDC case definition positive case with the high antibody concentration. So this is just the fifth example of what we're trying to say, that, quote, Lyme disease is just a knee. It's extremely rare and hardly anyone has it. And that suited the Lyme disease criminals just fine, because if you have a case definition where nobody has this disease and then you go out and try to vaccinate people and then have them come back to see whether or not they got that disease you have the vaccine for, you're going to say, oh, success, nobody got this imaginary disease. So that's what happened.
So what we've shown you so far is the Dearborn stunt, and we've shown you how everybody says there are two distinct diseases, and yet the only one that can get diagnosed is the 15% who have no symptoms except an arthritic knee. So if you're in the 85%, good luck. So that's what we're going to talk about next.
You've seen
how the bad guys want to change the definition of Lyme disease into just the arthritis in the knee, just the hypersensitivity response, just the HLA-linked arthritis. In this second section, we're going to show you that both these same characters and the likes of SUNY Stonybrook and others have said that this OSPE disease, or this disease that was written out of the case definition, the opposite of Lyme is just a knee, was a result also of Lymerix vaccination, such that OSPE disease is the very same thing as chronic neurologic Lyme. Okay, first one is Ben Luft at the 1998 FDA meeting, where he's remarking that the adverse events to Lymerix, or the OSPE vaccines, was protean or multisystem and not limited to just an arthritis. Here we're showing you that you should look up that word. We're not saying protein, we're saying protean, or multiple manifestations of a disease. So Ben Luft is saying the disease is really quite protean, and actually the adverse events are very similar to what the disease manifestations are. So here he is, Ben Luft in 1998, rebutting the definition of the disease, such as to say, actually, Lymerix is causing the very same multisystem disease as chronic neurologic Lyme itself. How to tell OSPE Lymerix disease from Lyme disease from a tick bite. U.S. Patent 6045804. It's owned by actually the Mayo Clinic, and the inventor is Dave Persing, who went over to a company called Corixa. He developed this test with Robert Schoen at Yale. It is a method for assessing Lyme infection without the OSPE or B plasmid, and it is to be used post-OSPE vaccines being on the market. You cannot test for a disease with the same antigen that is a vaccine. But importantly, in this patent, it says, vaccinated patients with multisystem complaints characteristic of later presentations of Lyme disease, which we all know of as chronic Lyme and not bad knee only, may be difficult to distinguish from patients with vaccine failure. So you cannot tell the difference between somebody who is Lymerix injured or a late neurologic Lyme patient.
All right, check it out. So the American Lyme Disease Foundation, or ALDF, was founded in 1990 as a propaganda firm to spin this disease that they already knew that they were going to try to commercialize. So here we have, in 1993, just 3 years later and a year before Dearborn, Alan Barber and Derlin Fish starting to trash their victims in print. Dilemmas in diagnosis and case management. Moreover, factors such as the pre-morbid personality and a tendency to somatization may determine the length of convalescence and the response to post-infection fatigue and joint aches. Even if the original diagnosis of Lyme disease is undisputed, lingering or recurrent symptoms, many of which are also characteristic of chronic fatigue syndrome or fibromyalgia, may not be attributable to persistent infection. So here, Barber and Fish are clearly attributing chronic neurolyme, post-sepsis, post-Lymerix Lyme to a psychiatric illness. At the time, in 93, chronic fatigue syndrome and fibromyalgia were considered mental illnesses. So he's calling Lyme crazy back there in 1993, right before Dearborn. This was because later in the report, they actually admit that the OSPE vaccine trials were underway, and they knew the OSPE vaccines were causing the same post-sepsis outcome. So this article proves unequivocally that these guys knew the OSPE vaccines were causing a disease, and they later threw out of the Dearborn case definition the chronic neurologic Lyme, and that they were trashing the victims. That's part of the racketeering charge. Now, back to the top. Until disease pathogenesis and immunity are better understood, the risk of provoking disease through vaccination cannot be accurately predicted. No shit, Sherlock. Looks like they knew. Moving on, some patients with Lyme disease involving the joints or nervous system do not improve substantially even after parenteral antibiotic therapy. That's IV antibiotics. Although doubts remain about many diagnoses of chronic Lyme disease, the specter of a large number of persons with unrelieved disabilities prompts further consideration of a burgdorferi vaccine for high-risk populations, such as outdoor workers and residents of endemic areas. Thought you said they were psychiatric, Alan. So here they're admitting that phase 1 trials of OspA vaccines were underway in 1993. They're also admitting the reason for having a vaccine in the first place is because of the result of chronic sepsis Lyme causing long-term disability with neurosymptoms, which is just like chronic fatigue syndrome or just like post-sepsis syndrome, which is the same thing. So here they're admitting all of it. They knew the vaccine caused problems. They knew the vaccine caused a disease like chronic Lyme. And then they falsified the case definition and threw all those patients out and said, you can only have Lyme disease if it's a bad knee and no other symptoms.
In 1994, at the FDA meeting on the vaccines, Raymond Datweiler protested the proposal that Lyme disease should be just a monoarticular arthritis in a knee or autoimmune knee. And in fact, he claimed that individuals with a poor immune response are the sicker ones. So Datweiler is all along objecting to the STEER and the CDC proposal that Lyme disease is only an autoimmune arthritis in a knee. The next slide, this one shows that SUNY Stony Brook with Halperin and Datweiler developed a seronegative Lyme assay. That is, if you have no Lyme antibodies in your blood because you're immunosuppressed, because you have a tick bite post-sepsis, Lyme-Rick's disease, they developed this test. In the body of the report, they're saying the cell-mediated arm of the immune response was intact, but there are no antibodies in the blood. This diminished antibody response is similar to T-cell anergy found in several chronic infections that are of the fungal type, e.g. infection with Mycobacterium leprae, Mycobacterium marinum, filaria and some chronic fungal infections. So here in 1988, they have this seronegative Lyme assay, and they're associating it with the typical immunosuppression that you see in fungal diseases. In the same year, in 1988, Datweiler published a report called Modulation of Natural Killer Cell Activity from Lyme Disease. People should get that report and read it clearly, because this is in 1988, and they're saying that the chronic neurologic form of Lyme disease is seronegative. But in the body of this report, he's saying the inhibition of antibody production, or the immunosuppression from Lyme disease, is due to not only the organism, but the supernatants from organism cultures. He's saying supernatants from the organism cultures also inhibit endogenous natural killer cell activity without prior exposure. So what he's saying is Borrelia lipids, which are going to be in the supernatant, because everyone knows oil and water don't mix, that stuff in the upper layer, which is going to be lipid-like, also inhibits natural killer cell activity, or also is immunosuppression. And that is where you're going to find OspA and the outer surface proteins, which are triacylated and lipid-like or fungal-like. This year, in 2016, University of California, San Francisco came out with a report showing that about half the patients who were treated for early Lyme disease did better, and half continued to have chronic illness signs. What this report doesn't say is what the immunology is like for early untreated Lyme disease. In other words, we don't know whether, as opposed to in this patient set, where half the patients who were treated early did well and half didn't, we don't know what would happen in untreated patients, because there is no such study. But the benefit of this report is that they say in early Lyme disease there is an inhibition of the immune response. It says a lack of activation of inflammatory T-cell, apoptotic, and B-cell development pathways as seen in other acute infectious syndromes. So in the beginning they say we're seeing immunosuppression and we're seeing changes to the immune system in half the patients. We're seeing that half the patients fail treatment and have to go on to have chronic illness. So that kind of refutes proposal of the CDC and the ALDF, who say most patients do well with treatment. Here they're saying half fail. In 1999 to 2000, while Lymerix was still on the market, causing all kinds of damage, Gary Wormser published a report, Modulation of Lymphocyte Proliferative Responses in Response to a Canine Outer Surface Protein A Vaccine. And what he's saying is that OspA causes immunosuppression, blunts normal lymphocyte responses to typical mitogens, and he's saying that the magnitude of the immunosuppression was directly related to the amount of OspA injected into these animals. He says, OspA interferes with the response of lymphocytes to proliferative stimuli, including a blocking of the cell cycle phase progression. Future studies designed to delete the particular region of or component of outer surface A molecule for this effect may lead to improved vaccine preparation. So here in 1999 to 2000, Gary Wormser is saying OspA causes immunosuppression. The next slide is another report from 2012, where on the bottom right-hand corner of the first page of the report, he's saying that there are two diseases. During natural infection, initiation of the host response begins with CD14 recognition of a triacylated Borrelia lipoproteins and subsequent activation of TLR2 and TLR1. And that's what we've been saying all along. Such bacterial recognition activates the NF-kappa B and other P38 pathways. The ensuing signaling cascades initiate inflammation-associated gene activities responsible for host defense, or Lyme arthritis, as well as negative regulatory pathways intended to mitigate the severity and duration of inflammation due to spirochetes. So in this report, in 2012, Gary Wormser states that the Borrelia triacylated lipoproteins could be bad. You're going to get either the Lyme arthritis hypersensitivity response, or you're going to get immunosuppression. Further back, before the Dearborn event, in 1990, Alan Steer published an article called Chronic Neurologic Manifestations of Lyme Disease. Now, 4 years later, he's saying there's no such thing. But in this report, we think it's interesting that he's, first of all, commenting that there is such a thing as chronic neurologic Lyme disease. He says it's very serious. Quote, months to years after the initial infection with Lyme disease, patients may have chronic encephalopathy, polyneuropathy, leukoencephalitis, blah, blah, blah. They need EMG studies and brain scans and blah, blah. He's saying they're very, very sick. And remarkably, to discover this set of patients, because they're mostly seronegative, he ends up using the seronegative Lyme assay developed by Raymond Datweiler in 1988. Steer says if the patient was seronegative according to these methods, the serum was further tested with immunoblotting, and peripheral blood mononuclear cells were tested for reactivity with Borrelia antigens by proliferative assay. That's the Datweiler 1988 seronegative Lyme assay. So in 1990, Alan Steer is talking about chronic neurologic Lyme patients, and he's finding them using the seronegative Lyme assay. That is a bit contrasted with what he said previously, which is that Lyme is only a bad knee and there is no such thing as seronegative Lyme. Here, this is Norman Latoff talking about the chronic neurologic Lyme-like outcomes of OspA vaccination. Neuropathy and cognitive impairment following vaccination with the OspA vaccine. So it's not just us saying that the OspA vaccine caused the same chronic neurologic disease.
Donald Marks was one of the OSPE vaccine trial administrators, in fact, and here he wrote a report saying that indeed there were all kinds of neurological adverse events to Lyme-Rix, which we know are the same as chronic Lyme because OSPE is a triazolipoprotein and causes immunosuppression. And then you have the typical immunosuppression outcomes where the opportunistic infections take over, like Epstein-Barr, cytomegalovirus, mycoplasma, candida, who knows what else. But Donald Marks was involved in the OSPE vaccine trials, and he says there were a whole lot of neurological adverse events reported after the actual official phase 3 trial of Lyme-Rix, and those adverse events were much like chronic neurologic Lyme. And in the end, he advises caution is raised on not actively looking for neurological adverse events, which was exactly what happened in the Lyme-Rix trial. They falsified the case definition, such as to say you can only have Lyme disease if it's an autoimmune arthritis in the knee, which represents only 15% of the population. That way they can throw out the 85% of the adverse events, which are seronegative Lyme. And here Marx is saying you should not discount chronic neurologic adverse events because that's exactly what these bad guys did in their Lyme vaccine trial. They falsified the case definition to leave out chronic neurologic Lyme because it was caused by the OSPE vaccine itself, and they said Lyme disease is just the knee. So this is yet another person, Donald Marks, saying the OSPE vaccine caused chronic neurologic disease. So they narrowed the case definition and threw out neurologic Lyme disease or chronic neurologic Lyme disease or this post-sepsis syndrome from a triazolipopeptide, which is a fungal antigen and causes immunosuppression. They threw out that case definition so that they could have a vaccine trial with an endotoxin, OSPE, and then throw out those adverse events, those immunosuppression events, and say, well, there's no such thing as that kind of chronic neurologic Lyme, because then they can throw that data out and say they have a successful vaccine. If you have a test that only detects 10% of the cases, and you're applying that test because you happen to own the vaccine for that disease, I mean, you're going to be guaranteed to have a 90% safe and effective vaccine because you've changed the definition. No one has that disease. They commercialized the disease. They threw out the chronic neurologic cases because it was caused by the vaccine too. They said, we'll just say it's an arthritis and we'll say everyone that has a chronic neurologic disease outcome, they're crazy. Outer surface protein A caused chronic neurologic Lyme, the very same disease they cut out of the case definition. What is OSPE? You have to know what OSPE actually is in order to find out how it actually causes immunosuppression. You know, who else besides ourselves are saying it was the vaccine, this triazolipopeptide, this endotoxin that was causing the immunosuppression that caused all the new great imitator outcomes of MS and lupus and ALS and stroke and everything else that happens as a result of Lyme. So what exactly is OSPE? And why do we say that Lyme disease is the same immunosuppression disease as Lyme-Rix disease? Here we have a graphic of PAM3 cis, or OSPE. You'll see 1, 2, 3 acyl groups attached at this very electronegative cysteine core. On the bottom right is the peptide group or the protein group, and that's variable. But what's very immunogenic is this basic PAM3 cis structure. It's managed by toll-like receptors 2 and 1, and you previously saw Gary Wormser say so. Well, anything that's managed by toll-like receptors 2 or 1 are endotoxins, and they're much more toxic than typical bacteria lipopolysaccharide. And the chronic exposure of the immune system to these endotoxins, PAM3 cis, triazolipopeptides, results in the immune system being shut off. The next slide is NIH's Dave Dorward talking about how these blebs are shed, exported by spirochetes, and they have OSPE on them. They also have DNA in them. And this is important because some people want to claim that the exported blebs or shed blebs could not possibly be responsible for causing chronic Lyme. In fact, that's exactly what's going on here. These exported shed blebs have OSPE and other similar OSPs on them, and when taken up inside an immune cell, the immune function is arrested or is stopped. In 2011, an independent group, it looks like a Chinese group, have published that, yes, indeed, these shed blebs, which are numerous and abundant, contain the outer surface proteins. So this is how spirochetes cause disease, by shedding these very antigenic triacyllipoproteins, which in the end turn off the immune system. Dave Persing, in 1994, wrote a report called Target Imbalance. He notices the relative abundance of this exported DNA in shed blebs as compared to cultivable spirochetes. So in 94, they're acknowledging that, hey, there are a lot more blebs than there are spirochetes. Well, that's what's really causing the disease. It's the immunosuppression from these spirochetes shedding blebs. In the next slide, we have a 1982 report by Alan Barber. He's talking about the action of penicillin on Borrelia hermsii or whatever. And there's a couple of graphics in there that you will want to see. These graphics should be burned into your brain. How does Lyme cause disease? Well, you'll see in the graphic, even in a case where there is no antibiotics in the culture disc, that there is a relative abundance of these very small balloon-like bubbles called blebs as compared to the number of spirochetes that you see in the image. So you should keep in mind that what is Lyme disease? Lyme disease is the destruction of the immune system via exporting these blebs, which once taken inside the immune cells, turn it off. There's another article from 1986 featuring Alan Barber and Stephen Bartol, in which one of them says, it's like bacterial Star Wars. These organisms pinch off a part of their surface protein, blebbing, to intercept antibody attack. Well, what's really happening is, rather than spirochetes issuing these blebs and they intercept antibodies, the spirochete is shedding these blebs and they're more like stealth bombering your immune system. They're turning off your immune system. This is how Lymerix, or OSPE, causes Lyme disease. It's the same thing. You cannot inject people with a large blob. You cannot inject people with a large amount of these fungal endotoxins and not expect a toxic shock result. Getting an injection of Lymerix would be similar to swabbing off the scum in your bathroom and putting it into a needle and injecting it into you. This is what these guys did. In 2010, Kadavid, and he's saying these exported blebs with the outer surface proteins on them can be carried into the brain and inflame it. In 2006, many people don't know this, but the National Institutes of Neurological Disorders and Stroke had a MS and Lyme group. Multiple sclerosis is nothing like just a bad knee. Those two, Martin and Marquez, said these toll-like receptor 2 and 1 agonists, such as OSPE, cause humoral immunosuppression, or no antibodies in the blood, but chronically inflame the brain. And finally, we have this report by Alcott from Johns Hopkins recently, I think it was this year or else it was 2015, says, we have this new test where we're going to capture these blebs and look for Borrelia DNA or the antigen on them, which is a very old test and people have been doing it for years. So here we are in 2016. The idiots at Johns Hopkins are saying, hey, idea, let's do what Dave Dorward and the NIH recommended in 1990 to detect Lyme. So that's where we are right now. In the next 3 slides, we're showing you 3 other attempts at lipoprotein vaccines that all failed in the same way Lymerix failed. All of them failed, they all caused immunosuppression, and they ruined the immunity of the victims. This one is about comparable organisms, in addition to the mycobacteria, besides
Borrelia and syphilis spirochetes that also shed and export lipoproteins on their outer membrane vesicles that they export or shed. And they cause the same immunosuppression as we saw with Borrelia burgdorferi and OSPE. So the bottom line here is we're showing you 3 or 4 in parallel mechanisms with other organisms that are attempts to either use these antigens as vaccines or that model how Borrelia shed blebs with OSPs on them, turning off the immune response. This one is by Justin Radolph and Clifford Harding. It is more specifically about the downregulation of antigen-presenting cells, i.e. you're not going to have antibodies when hit with these antigens, i.e. the Lyme vaccine probably did not produce antibodies. They say inhibition of MHC antigen processing by either tuberculosis or the purified tuberculosis lipoprotein was dependent on TLR2 and independent of TLR4, i.e. these are not regular bacteria, end quote. Synthetic analogs of lipopeptides from Treponema pallidum also inhibited antigen processing. He probably means Borrelia burgdorferi. He probably means Lyme there, or PAM3 cis. Despite the ability of the tuberculosis 19 kilodalton lipoprotein to activate microbicidal and innate immune functions in early infection, TLR2 dependent inhibition of HLA molecule expression and antigen processing, i.e. antibody productions, by this lipoprotein during later stages of macrophage infection may prevent presentation of these antigens and decrease recognition by T cells. This mechanism may allow intracellular tuberculosis bugs to evade immune surveillance and maintain chronic infection. So this is a parallel model of the exact same thing that happens with spirochetes. They shed fungal antigens, they turn off the immune response, and that helps them to evade surveillance. But more importantly than that, and we'll get into this later, the toll-like receptor 2 agonist tolerance here, this is explaining what tolerance really is. You no longer see this type of antigen as a foreign invader, spreads to TLR4 agonists and TLR7/9 agonists, which we call cross tolerance, and we'll talk about that later. Interestingly, in 1995, Anthony Fauci applied for a patent for interleukin-2, quote, immunologic enhancement therapy. Interestingly, because what other conditions do we know about that might need immune enhancement? Maybe some immunosuppression diseases? The content of the patent, and people should read this because it's just great. Background of the invention, illustrative of specific disease states and treatment of which the present invention can be applied are HIV and other diseases characterized by a decrease of T-cell immunity, where you heard that before, for example, by mycobacterial infections like tuberculosis and fungal infections such as cryptococcal disease or Lyme. This method also can be used in the treatment of secondary infections that occur in patients with suppressed immune systems, such as the opportunistic infections that occur in AIDS patients. So here in 1995, Anthony Fauci is talking about the well-known phenomenon of the recurrence of opportunistic infections, especially post-fungal infection. And what are those opportunistics that we know about? Epstein-Barr, HHV6, cytomegalovirus, zoster, Candida, mycoplasma, and so on. All the things that make you feel very sick with Lyme. Give that man an award. Promote him to the head of the class. Next we have Nicole Baumgarth and Stephen Bartold at University of California, Davis, talking about how Borrelia burgdorferi targets the lymph nodes within the first 24 hours of infection. And Baumgarth says, the researchers found that following Borrelia burgdorferi infection, this process even prevented the induction of a strong immune response to an influenza infection or a virus. You've seen what Datweiler and others have said about how the sickest patients are seronegative. So at this point, what Nicole Baumgarth has done recently, this is a 2015 report, is show from a completely independent point of view, or a completely independent group, saying Lyme disease causes immunosuppression, it causes the B cells to no longer function, it causes the B cells to be incompetent to viral infections too, and we've shown this in the Occam's Razor report from other scientists like H.P. Redman, Hotchkiss, Philippe, Harding, Radolf, Medvedev, etc. in our Occam's Razor report. And they all say that fungal antigens like this, like Lymerix, cause immunosuppression and cross-tolerance to other infections. So you end up with an AIDS-like illness, otherwise known as post-sepsis syndrome. This matches what Raymond Datweiler et al. Published in 1989 in its own journal called the Reviews of Infectious Diseases, where he states that treatment fails in half the cases of chronic neurologic disease, and that he proposes that this could be due to pathologic changes that occur prior to treatment. In this same IDSA journal, Paul DeRay, who is a pathologist for the U.S. Army, the National Cancer Institute, and Yale University, found in the spinal fluid of chronic neurologic Lyme victims that immature B cells can also be seen in the fluid. These cells can appear quite atypical, not unlike those of transformed or neoplastic lymphocytes. Later in a 1992 book edited by Steve Schutzer, he said that these look like Epstein-Barr transformed cells.
So you just heard DeRay and Datweiler in 1989 in IDSA's journal, Reviews of Infectious Diseases, and they said three things. Number one, they said pathologic changes occur prior to treatment. 2, B cells in the spinal fluid appear to be mutated. And 3, treatment fails in half the cases. And what do you know? That is exactly the same thing that we're hearing in 2015 and 2016 from UC Davis and UCSF. So go figure, here we are, 26 years later. How many people disabled, how many people dead, and we're hearing the same thing. So that's 26 years lost just into oblivion because these guys wanted to sell their vaccine. Now we still hear people almost on a daily basis saying, but I didn't get the vaccine, so I'm not going to listen to anything you're saying. Well, if you've made it this far, then hopefully you understand that part. But if not, then watch what's next.
All right, Lyme 101. This is a question that we get all the time, and it is, I didn't get the Lymerix vaccine, so why should I be concerned? How does this affect me? I never got the vaccine. Oh, maybe I did get the vaccine. No, you probably didn't. Lymerix vaccine was OSPE, which was injected into the victims. OSPE went into their bloodstream, munched up by the immune cells, and then immune system kaput. Done. Game over. Now, tick bite OSPE injection. You have your spirochete, gets into your bloodstream, blebs off its outer surface. It's got the OSPEs all over it. Your immune cells come along and munch, 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 munch. Kablooey, there goes your immune system. Done. Kaput. Game over.
Sorry, so what I just showed you was. Yes, you did have Lymerix disease.
So, what I just showed you is that, yes, you do have Lymerix disease, whether you got it injected via a syringe or via a tick bite. Any questions?
Who's responsible for this crime? Well, the American Lyme Disease Foundation, the ALDF, is central to the entire crime. The ALDF was founded in 1990, within a year of the bad guys reporting in ITS's journal that treatment fails in half the cases and that Lyme produces Epstein-Barr-like transformed lymphocytes in the spinal fluid. So they knew already that it was causing immunosuppression. And they created this organization, this fake nonprofit, to spin the disease. So the same characters involved with the ALDF, the fake nonprofit, are the ones who own all the patents, and they spun the disease at Dearborn. Barber, Fish, Schoen, Persing, they're either on ALDF's board or scientific advisors or both. They are all involved in some capacity. New York Medical College was another player. Arthur Weinstein, who was chairman of the OSPE Vaccine Data and Safety Monitoring Board, was interviewed in the late 90s, and he said about New York Medical College, "The college has recognized that Lyme disease is a major clinical and research interest on this campus. The main players are Derlin Fish, PhD, Gary Wormser, and John Connolly." So he comes right out and he says, bam, 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 here's who's responsible. John J. Connolly, the really creepy ghost demon-looking guy, was president of New York Medical College at the time ALDF was founded. The college was financially floundering, so they made a deal with Kaiser Permanente to stay afloat, and that's when they founded ALDF. But now Kaiser's part of this scam, and they actually write the training modules, so they're one of the worst offenders when it comes to Lyme disease. So this ALDF is not really a nonprofit. It was a front for the promotion of their vaccines and a propaganda PR firm to spin the disease and carry on the pretense that Dearborn was legitimate. Edward McSwegan was another ALDF founder. He was actually the one who started it all. As the program officer at the NIH, he would direct grants to all of his cronies to capitalize on the free money. He actually wrote about doing this in a 1986 letter to Senator Barry Goldwater, basically trashing the U.S. Navy, who actually had this kind of research in their division, saying they were incompetent. McSwegan got control of grant distribution at the NIH, gave it to all of his cronies, then they spun the disease for the profit. The Bayh-Dole Act took place in 1980, so they were taking advantage of that. McSwegan decided to trash the Navy, steal their funding, and give it to all of his crooked pals, then founded the ALDF. Bam! Alan Barber's patents. Just go to the patent database and look him up. Search his name with Borrelia and see what kinds of patents he owns. Here's a list of 30. You can do that with any of these crooks. Just search their name and Borrelia. Now, we really want to emphasize this 1993 report from Alan Barber and Derlin Fish. The vaccine trials were underway by the time Dearborn happened, and they were already trashing us. They were slandering and libeling us, knowing that there was this immunosuppression neuro-Lyme outcome. The Barber-Fish report from 1993 shows the vaccine trials were already underway before Dearborn took place, and that they knew it was a problem. So they went ahead and slandered us and used all this misogyny terminology and called us crazy, and that makes them a racketeering entity because they abuse their positions to deny us our rights. They're using their position of authority to abuse us and slander us and libel us with the intent to deny access to medical care. That's part of a racketeering charge. The CDC is using their authority to slander and libel us, causing injury, which is deprivation of rights or discrimination. And here's CDC officer Alan Barber in 1993 very clearly saying that we're somatizing and crazy, but the manly man forestry workers, they can have Lyme. And I've seen personally, I've experienced this, how it influences the medical community, how it makes them hostile toward us, push psych drugs on us, which are contraindicated, by the way. So they're encouraging this abuse of patients, particularly women and children. And that's a color of law charge. Put them away for good. Barbara Johnson, CDC officer. She was there all along. She owns patents with SmithKline in Europe. Is that even legal? SmithKline ended up making Limerick's, and she ran the Dearborn stunt. And what's notable about her 5 patents from 1992 and 1993 is that she states that there are HLA-linked and non-HLA-linked outcomes, which is exactly our point. If they know that there is this immunosuppression outcome for 85%, they certainly knew they did not have a vaccine. So the very people who own the patents and spun the disease did so for their own patent royalties. And they created this fake nonprofit called the ALDF to help spin Lyme disease and other vector-borne diseases into something profitable that they could sell as vaccines and test kits. The ALDF is like a marketing or PR firm for the patent holders. It's not really a nonprofit. The very same people who own the patents are on the board of the ALDF and also performed the Dearborn stunt. None of it was legitimate. It was all performed by people who should not have been near it because they owned the patents.
Yale's Errol Fickrig and Richard Flavell together applied for 2 patents. One of them was for Limerick's, so they're the inventors for Limerick's, and that patent number is 5747294. And they also developed a scientifically valid way to detect Lyme disease, and that patent was 5618533. That method, 5618533, is a validated method per the FDA's rules for the validation of an analytical method. Why? You distinguish species of Borrelia by differences in their flagellum. So Borrelia are taxonomically organized by their differences and similarities in flagellum. So Borrelia burgdorferi, the species, has a specific flagellum DNA code. Fickrig and Flavell identified the section of Borrelia burgdorferi flagellum that didn't cross-react with other spirochetes or other Borrelia, not Hermsii, Anserina, or whatever else. So they own a patent for the specific detection of Borrelia burgdorferi, the species. So that meets the specificity requirement. They then tested this in the field and found that it detected 17 out of 18 known cases of Lyme disease. It detects 94 to 95% of the known cases, meets the, quote, accuracy requirement for an FDA validation. So Fickrig and Flavell own a scientifically valid method to detect Lyme disease, and they own the Limerick's patent. So they could have used this scientifically valid method for Borrelia-specific flagellum to assess the outcome of Limerick's, but they didn't. They instead used the bogus Dearborn method. Okay, so Persing owns this patent 6045804. It is the racketeering patent where Dave Persing's new company, Corixa, together with Immugen in Norwood, Massachusetts, and Yale's L2 Diagnostics, run by Robert Schoen, were to be the only labs in North America. Corixa, Immugen, and Yale's L2 Diagnostics were to be the only laboratories in North America licensed to use this RICO method, whereby once Limerick's, owned by Yale, was on the market, you could only send your blood to those 3 laboratories to test for Lyme and tick-borne diseases. That was the whole point of doing this. The 3 companies, Corixa, Immugen, and Yale's L2 Diagnostics, were listed in the Securities and Exchange Commission as formerly, quote, partners, and they intended to capture in all the blood that they would get for vector-borne diseases testing any new pathogens that come along as tick-borne diseases. So it was a whole monopoly on not just grants, funding, and laboratory fees for testing for tick-borne diseases, but any future patents for the DNA that they intended to then own and make test kits for and vaccines for in the future that they got from everyone's blood in North America. That was the racketeering entity. So the presentation that you've just seen explains what is OSPE disease, or how did the CDC, perpetrators of this crime, falsify the case definition to leave out the kind of disease that causes a chronic, devastating neurologic disease with the chronic fatigue. They redefined Lyme disease such as to be only the genetically linked, HLA-linked, autoimmune arthritis in a knee. And so that they say you can't have a disease unless you have this inflammation. Well, we know there is diseases of immunosuppression because there's AIDS. And Anthony Fauci has a patent for an immune booster, interleukin-2. Then we went on to show you what exactly is OSPE and how does it cause illness or immunosuppression illness as a lipoprotein. And we showed it to you in parallel. We showed you mycoplasma, mycobacteria, brucella, and we showed you all these scientists who are saying the same thing. Radolf, Harding, Medvedev, and so on. And we also showed you Nicole Baumgarth in University of California, San Francisco. I think the man's name is Chu, who's the lead author. That the immune damage is done right away, early in the disease. So that was 2015 and 2016, where University of California, Davis, and San Francisco said Lyme and Lyme-Rix disease caused B-cell changes. Early treatment didn't help, and you run a 50% chance of recovering, regardless of treatment. Raymond Datweiler had made this hypothesis in the late 80s when he discovered that Borrelia burgdorferi and its supernatants inhibited natural killer cell activity. And he likened that to other fungal diseases. So you have this continuity where from the mid-80s to the late 80s, these same people who were getting all these grants for Lyme disease, studying it, especially the immunology of it, found that Lyme and Lyme-Rix, or the supernatant and lipid layer, caused immunosuppression. Datweiler hypothesized that the reason treatment fails in half the cases is due to the pathologic changes that occur prior to treatment, and that's just what these University of California groups found. So here, all this time has been lost from 1989. When the Infectious Diseases Society of America published a special supplement just on Lyme and spirochetal diseases, left it hanging in the air. We don't know what to do. Half the treatment fails in half the cases. The CDC said Lyme is like neurosyphilis, and on and on and on. And then in between, we had this entity emerge called the American Lyme Disease Foundation, who spun the disease. They said, well, we can't sell a vaccine for diseases that are known to be fungal and immunosuppressing, so let's just pick this odd hypersensitivity outcome, the arthritis, and say that's Lyme disease. So that's what happened. And it has to be prosecuted. It has to be prosecuted in order to vindicate and validate all the suffering out there, all the misery, all the rejection, all the being declined Social Security disability, social ostracization, and all of the misery of having to live like you're a ghost in society. Nobody sees you, nobody cares about you, you're just not there. And the only way we can bring these people back into the world is to have it prosecuted. So that's what our agenda is. Last year in 2015, a small group of us went to Washington, D.C. to protest the Justice Department. Senator Blumenthal had sued these characters for antitrust in 2006. His same office sent me to the Justice Department in New Haven to file a racketeering complaint about these guys because they understood that the bad guys, the CDC, had changed the case definition. That was when they referred me to the Justice Department. So that complaint was filed in 2003. Blumenthal sued them in 2006, and nothing really has happened since then. The reason Blumenthal's lawsuit failed was because he didn't have ILADs behind him, and he didn't have any kind of scientific expertise to come forth with the information that the Dearborn case definition was falsified. So where do we go from here? When we protested last year at the Justice Department, we also lobbied, and we got to one of the offices of the head of the Senate Judiciary Committee. That was Jeff Sessions at the time. And his staff lawyer told us, when we gave him this same presentation, and he understood it, the testing was falsified, the real disease is an immunosuppression disease like AIDS, quote, like AIDS. He said, well, we can't force the Justice Department to do their jobs. We can only have a Senate hearing where you present all this same scientific information and prove the fraud only. And then we can refer it to the Justice Department. So that's where we are right now. So after you're aware that this is really what's going on and this is the status of the disease, where do you think we should go next?
So if you get bit by an infected tick, you've got a 50-50 chance of ending up completely screwed. So we need to start thinking differently about activism. Activism isn't about commiserating with other sufferers on Lyme. It's about the bigger picture of who else in the world is suffering. We've got 2 million people a year, 1 million of them becoming disabled eventually. So we're talking about the million who are going to become disabled next year, and the year after that, and the year after that. Activism is not about talking in circles about who's suffering the worst. It's about helping these other people down the line. Because you keep talking in circles and nobody hears a thing that you say.
Okay, so the bottom line is that this has to be prosecuted. And if it isn't prosecuted, once this all is all brought forward, then we can expect that there's something much more sinister going on. And that has international ramifications.
We want 3 things. We want validation, we want vindication, and we want prosecution.